This is my neighborhood project in the Spring Valley area. So my food environment in my neighborhood does not allow for me to have adequate access to healthy foods. In the 20-minute walking distance that's considered my walkability in my neighborhood, there's only 2 grocery stores while there's 17 different options for fast food. So my neighborhood is considered to be a food desert. My MRFEI score, also known as the My Modified Retail Food Environment Index, is a 6.25, and this is due to I have 2 healthy food retailers while having 30 less healthy food retailers. So out of those 30, 8 are convenience stores, one's a specialty food store, 17 are fast food outlets, and there's 4 restaurants in my neighborhood. Some supports and barriers to healthy eating. So the supports is that there is grocery store produce, and in this produce at the grocery stores, there are frequent sales that I've noticed. There's also in the grocery stores a greater variety to choose from for healthy foods when you compare them to fast food and convenience stores. Some barriers to healthy eating in my neighborhood is that there is a lot more fast food available, and fast food and convenience store food options tend to be faster, easier, and sometimes cheaper. The last barrier is that there are not many stores available with produce in my area, so it is just the 2 grocery stores that I mentioned previously. So one thing that I would recommend implementing in order to improve my food environment would be to add a farmer's market closer to my neighborhood in order to give the residents better access to healthy and fresh foods. So the closest one I have to me right now is 5.1 miles away, which is about a 2-hour walk. And so being able to have a farmer's market closer to me will be a big, big difference. It'll allow me to get a lot more fresh food, healthy food. Alright, so physical activity. So in my neighborhood, there's only access to one park, and it's located on a very busy intersection. And there's also 2 different green spaces available. So for that park on the busy intersection, it actually is really big, and it's filled with an area with exercise equipment. It has a large green space that's able to hold up to 4 different soccer games at once. It's really big. There's multiple walking trails, there's a few different playgrounds, there's a few tennis courts, and there's also basketball courts available to use. The supports and barriers to physical activity in my neighborhood. So to start with, the supports for physical activity is that there are a lot of sidewalk and crosswalks available to use. My neighborhood is partially mixed land use, so there's access to food, offices, a few retail, but it is mostly residential. My neighborhood has a well-connected network of street connectivity, and because of this, I get more route choices, and this leads to shorter trip distances, and distance is a critical factor when you're making the decision whether you're going to walk somewhere or not. Some barriers to physical activity in my neighborhood is that there's a lot of busy streets, and like these streets have a higher speed limit, and in my neighborhood there's also a high reliability on vehicles, and I think this is partially due to the lack of public transit options, not only in my neighborhood but also in the city. One thing that we could do to improve the physical activity environment in my neighborhood would be to have a higher mixed land use. If this were to happen, myself and my neighbors would be more inclined to walk around our neighborhood more often and increase our own physical activity levels. And my neighborhood specifically, we could use more parks and green spaces a lot closer to where I live, since the one park that we have is right on the edge of my walkability. It's a 20-minute walk. We could also use more retail stores and recreational areas. My bikeability score in my neighborhood is a 46 out of 100. So that is actually pretty low. 0 to 49 means that you have very low bike infrastructure. And as you can see on those two pictures, there are no bike lanes on either the residential street or the main arterial street. There's no bike lanes whatsoever. And if you look on the main street, that's Tropicana, the right lane isn't even any bigger than any of the other lanes. So it would not be safe to ride your bike on that at all. And the speed limit's also 45, which is pretty high. Some of the supports and barriers for bikeability in my area is that some of the supports is that it is low cost when you're comparing bikes to cars. Bikes are more affordable and you don't have to pay for car insurance or gas, which is a rising expense these days. Some barriers to bikeability in my neighborhood is that there are no bike lanes whatsoever, so it's not as safe as when you compare it to neighborhoods with bike lanes. There's also a lot of traffic, it's always pretty busy, and there's no walking or biking trails anywhere in my neighborhood. One way that we can improve bikeability in my neighborhood would be to add buffered bike lanes to the roads. So buffered bike lanes provide larger distances between the bicyclists and vehicles. It also allows for bicyclists to pass other bicyclists without having to go into the car lane. Also, when cars are parked in the bike lane, the buffered bike lanes provide a bigger space to pass the parked car without going into the car lane. But I think the most important factor when thinking about adding buffered bike lanes is that it would encourage more bicycling, more bicyclists, due to the fact that there'd be an increased perception of safety due to the increased distance between the bicyclist and the cars on the road. So the walkability in my neighborhood walk score is 50, which is not very high, but it's not really low either. So there are sidewalks on both of the main street and my residential streets. They're all about 4 feet wide. On my main street, Tropicana, which is the picture on the left, there is a brick wall and poles acting as a buffer, while on the residential street, the picture on the right, Edmond Street, there is dirt, pebbles, and trees acting as a buffer. The curb cuts for mobility devices were 5 feet on Tropicana and only 4 feet on Edmond Street. My neighborhood transit score was 39 out of 100, so that's pretty low. There were only transit stops on Tropicana, my main street, and not in any of my residential area or any of the residential streets. This bus stop did have a bench and some shade, but the one right across the street from it, going in the other direction, did not have a bench or shade, but only the brick wall that was shown in the previous picture. Some supports and barriers for walkability in my neighborhood. So the supports is that there are no barriers on the sidewalk. So all the sidewalks that I saw were relatively flat. There were nothing was raised. There wasn't any cracks. It was relatively safe to walk on. And on my residential streets, I couldn't perceive any crime. Like I felt safe to walk on. It was comfortable to walk on. And on all my streets, there were sidewalks. So I know in some neighborhoods there's no sidewalks, but there's sidewalks in my neighborhood. Some of the barriers for walkability in my neighborhood. Uh, you just have to remember that my neighborhood is very automobile depending, so that leads to heavy traffic. There's also a lot of faded crosswalks in my area, so it can be hard for the drivers to see. Also, I think a really big factor for walkability, not only in my neighborhood, but in Las Vegas, is the weather. So Las Vegas is known to have really hot summers, and they are very harsh, and it makes people not want to go outside for long periods of time, especially doing physical activities outside, such as walking or biking. So one way that we could improve the walkability would be to implement a transit-based community. So this type of community puts pedestrians and bicyclists as higher priorities. And since they're higher priorities, this makes them feel safer and makes them feel more incentivized to walk or bike around, and it increases their physical activity levels. This type of community allows for a high mixed land use to be available within 10-minute walk of the transit stations.